66 million years ago, the dinosaurs disappeared, and something else stepped into the silence. Not mammals, not reptiles, birds. For millions of years, they held the top of the food chain, not with claws or venom or size alone, but with beaks that could split bone, wingspans that swallowed the horizon, and frames built so efficiently that nothing alive today compares. Some were aerial, some were terrestrial. Some blurred the line between the two in ways that still don't fully make sense. The Andes, 6 million years ago. The air is thinner than it is today. The landscape open and exposed. Grasslands stretching toward horizons that nothing is watching from ground level. Nothing from the ground needs to. Argentavis magnificens had a wingspan estimated between 23 and 26 feet. To put that in terms that actually register, a modern hang glider runs about 30 feet tip to tip. This bird was close. A condor, the largest flying bird alive today, maxes out around 10 feet. Argentavis was more than double that. The weight estimates sit around 70 to 80 kilograms, possibly more. That raises an immediate mechanical problem. Birds that heavy don't flap. The energy cost is prohibitive. Argentavis almost certainly relied on thermal soaring, riding columns of rising warm air, the way albatrosses exploit wind shear over open ocean. It found a current, locked its wings, and covered distance efficiently. The skull structure points toward a feeding style closer to vulture than falcon, a hooked beak suited for tearing into carcasses rather than actively pursuing prey, which reframes the image somewhat. It wasn't an aerial hunter diving on targets. It was a continent-scale scavenger, circling over thousands of square kilometers of South American landscape, watching for something already dead or close enough to it. At that size, Argentavis had no meaningful aerial competition. Whatever it spotted, it reached. Whatever it wanted, it ate. The only real constraint was finding enough thermals to stay airborne, and in the late Miocene Andes, that wasn't much of a constraint at all. It went extinct around 6 million years ago. The leading explanations involve climate shifts and the gradual loss of the large megafauna carcasses its diet depended on. The food supply contracted. The bird did not adapt. What replaced it never reached that size again. 30 million years before Argentavis, something was already pushing the upper boundary of what powered flight can physically support. Pelagornis sandersi. Wingspan estimates land between 20 and 24 feet, overlapping with Argentavis, possibly exceeding it. The distinction matters because Pelagornis wasn't a scavenger circling land thermals. It was a pelagic hunter, open ocean, thousands of miles from any coast, riding wind gradients the way modern albatrosses do, except at a scale that makes albatrosses look like a rough draft. The bones were hollow to a degree that seems almost structurally irresponsible. Wall thickness measured in fractions of a millimeter in some sections. The entire skeleton was built around one engineering priority: reducing mass so something this large could generate enough lift to stay airborne. It worked, but it left no margin. A Pelagornis that broke a wing didn't recover. It landed on water it couldn't take off from, and that was the end of it. The teeth complicate things further. Not true teeth. Pelagornis was a bird, and birds lost teeth long before this, but bony projections along the beak edges that functioned like them. Pseudo-teeth. Backward-pointing, interlocking, designed to grip wet, slippery prey that would otherwise slide free. Fish, squid, whatever was near the surface and slow enough. The beak closed, and nothing inside it went anywhere. What makes Pelagornis genuinely difficult to categorize is the question of takeoff. Birds this heavy require a running start, favorable wind, or both. The leading hypothesis involves dynamic soaring, the same technique used by wandering albatrosses, exploiting the velocity difference between wind layers just above the ocean's surface. In practice, it meant Pelagornis was dependent on wind conditions. Calm water was a problem. It survived for roughly 25 million years across that constraint. The fossil record found in South Carolina suggests it ranged far, probably globally. For most of the Oligocene and into the Miocene, nothing in the air matched it for reach. Paraphysornis brasilensis, Brazil, Miocene. Around 1.4 meters tall, which undersells it, the skull alone reached nearly half a meter in length. The beak was deep, laterally compressed, and hooked at the tip with a downward curve that concentrated force into a narrow contact point. Not built for crushing, built for driving downward, for impact. The functional interpretation that holds up best involves a strike-and-release hunting strategy. Paraphysornis likely didn't grapple with prey. Its neck and beak mechanics suggest it delivered rapid, repeated downward strikes, then waited. The target would be stunned, disoriented, unable to coordinate escape. Then it struck again. The killing wasn't immediate. It was methodical. This is where Paraphysornis sits in an uncomfortable middle position within the terrorbird family. It wasn't the largest. Kelenken was larger. It wasn't the most studied. Phorusrhacos has that distinction. But the skull proportions of Paraphysornis suggest a bite force and strike geometry that may have exceeded both, optimized not for speed or size, but for delivering concentrated mechanical damage to a specific point. Brazil in the Miocene was warm, heavily vegetated in places, open in others. Paraphysornis occupied the open zones, the kind of terrain where a 1.4 meter bird with a half-meter skull could see far enough to hunt effectively and move without obstruction. It shared that landscape with early South American ungulates, small to mid-sized mammals, and very little that could meaningfully threaten it. Kelenken guillemois. That skull measured 71 centimeters, the largest bird skull ever recovered from the fossil record. The beak accounted for most of that length, hooking downward at the tip in a curve that concentrated the entire mechanical force of a strike into one contact point. Functional modeling confirms the beak was not designed for lateral stress. It wasn't built to wrestle or twist. Straight down, hard, precise. The geometry of something that expected to connect. The rest of the body follows the same logic. Leg bones indicate a build optimized for speed over endurance, fast twitch muscle architecture, long stride, quick acceleration over short distance. Kelenken probably didn't pursue prey across kilometers. It closed distance fast, struck before the target could orient, and the engagement ended there. Total height estimates reach around 3 meters, weight around 220 kilograms. Patagonia, approximately 15 million years ago, open steppe, dry and exposed, swept by wind coming off terrain that hadn't yet fully risen into the Andes. At that size, the list of things in that landscape presenting a genuine threat to Kelenken is short enough that listing them isn't particularly useful. What's worth noting is the continental context. South America was still an island, geographically isolated, its fauna developing under entirely separate pressures. No large cats, no competing apex predators with the body plan to challenge something 3 meters tall, moving at speed across open ground. The ecological vacancy was total, and Kelenken filled it completely. One skull, Everything else is reconstruction. Careful, anatomically grounded reconstruction, but reconstruction. The animal it implies is coherent. The gaps just happen to be large enough that some details remain genuinely uncertain. The skull is not uncertain. That part is sitting in a museum in Argentina. Smaller. That's the first thing the fossil record tells you about Andalgalornis stuleti, and for approximately 30 seconds, it sounds like a step down. It wasn't. Andalgalornis lived in northwestern Argentina during the late Miocene and into the Pliocene, a span of several million years that suggests it was doing something right. Height around 1.4 meters, weight estimates in the 40-kilogram range. Against Kelenken, it looks modest. Against anything it was actually hunting, the proportions tell a different story. A 2010 biomechanical study published in PLOS 1 modeled the skull under simulated loading conditions. What it found was that the beak of Andalgalornis was structurally weak under lateral and torsional stress. It bent and twisted poorly, which, again, sounds like a limitation until the same study modeled its performance under axial loading. Straight down, pure, vertical force. In that direction, the beak was rigid, efficient, and capable of transmitting substantial impact energy into a very small contact area. The implication is a hunting style built around precision, not brute force, not sustained grappling, a rapid downward strike to a specific anatomical target, the skull, the spine, delivered fast enough that the prey had no effective response window. The weapon wasn't size, it was accuracy under speed. This matters ecologically because it meant Andalgalornis could operate on prey that a larger terror bird might have handled differently. The niche wasn't identical to Kelenken's. The body plan solved a different version of the same problem: how to convert a bird's frame into an efficient killing machine, and arrived at a different answer. It survived longer than most of its relatives. The Pliocene was a period of significant faunal change in South America, with the Great American Biotic Interchange beginning to introduce North American species into the continent. Andalgalornis persisted through the early stages of that disruption. At some point, the disruption won. The beak is what everything about Gastornis eventually returns to. Not hooked, not tapered, deep, rounded, and massive in a way that resists easy classification. A beak shaped for applying sustained compressive force rather than tearing or piercing, which sounds predatory until the geochemical evidence complicates that reading entirely. For most of the 20th century, Gastornis was reconstructed as a hunter. The size supported it, 1.75 meters tall, thick, powerful legs, a skull large relative to body size. Early paleo artists put it standing over small mammals, and that image settled into popular understanding before the calcium isotope analysis arrived. That method distinguishes plant-based diets from animal-based ones through isotopic signatures preserved in bone. The Gastornis results came back consistent with herbivory. The beak, reconsidered through that lens, makes functional sense as a tool for processing tough vegetation. Hard seeds, fibrous stems, material requiring sustained crushing force. The rounded depth concentrated compressive load efficiently. Not a weapon, but a mill. The problem is that calcium isotope analysis carries uncertainty at small sample sizes, and the Gastornis studies haven't resolved that limitation. Some researchers remain unconvinced. The debate sits open. Europe, roughly 55 million years ago, was fragmented, partially submerged, tropical in places that are now temperate, palms where Germany will eventually be. Whatever Gastornis was eating, nothing in that environment was equipped to challenge it. The early mammals sharing its habitat were small, cautious things. shaped by pressures that didn't include something this size moving through the undergrowth. Predator or herbivore, the answer doesn't change that particular dynamic much. The name that started this entire category of nightmare, Phorus racos longissimus, Argentina, Miocene, approximately 15 to 13 million years ago. The specimen that gave terror birds their reputation, described by Florentino Ameghino in 1887, initially misidentified as a large toothless mammal, then corrected, and the correction was somehow worse. Height around 2.5 meters. Weight estimates between 130 and 160 kilograms. The skull reached 65 centimeters, the beak hooking downward at the tip in the same concentrated impact geometry seen across the Phorus racid family. Phorus racos sits at a particular intersection of size, speed, and build that makes it the representative specimen for good reason. Not because it was the largest or the fastest, but because those variables combined into something that functioned with unusual completeness. The leg structure indicates a running speed that current estimates place somewhere between 45 and 60 kilometers per hour over short distance. For context, a healthy human sprints at roughly 25. The gap is not close. What made Phorus racos ecologically significant wasn't any single feature. It was the combination: large enough to handle substantial prey, fast enough to run down anything it targeted, equipped with a beak designed to end engagements quickly rather than prolong them. A 160-kilogram bird moving at speed and driving that beak downward was delivering an impact that small to mid-sized prey had no structural answer to. South America in the Miocene provided the conditions for this to work without interruption. Island continent, no competing large predators, abundant prey that had never developed defensive adaptations against something with this body plan. Phorus racos didn't need to be subtle. The environment had never produced anything that required it to be. The fossil record for Phorus racos is comparatively rich. Multiple specimens, enough material to build reliable reconstructions. It's the terror bird we know best, which is probably why it became the image people reach for when this family comes up. Ameghino thought he'd found a mammal. The actual animal was considerably less comforting. This one requires a different kind of honesty. Silopterus appears in older literature as a distinct Phorus racid genus, a terror bird classification that circulated through parts of the 20th century before the taxonomic ground shifted beneath it. The name derives from fragmentary material, isolated bones, incomplete specimens. Classifications made before comparative anatomy had the reference library it has now. The current scientific consensus does not recognize Silopterus as a valid genus. The material attributed to it has been reassigned, absorbed into better supported classifications, or left in the ambiguous category the fossil record reserves for things it isn't ready to fully explain yet. Which raises something worth sitting with for a moment. The terror bird family, Phorus racidae, is reconstructed from a fossil record that is incomplete. The specimens we have are the ones that fossilized, which means they died in the right conditions and survived millions of years of geological pressure without being destroyed. The species we've named are a sample. The actual diversity of large predatory birds that walked South America across 30 million years was almost certainly broader than what the record shows. Silopterus is a name that didn't survive scrutiny. But the question it points toward, how many of these animals existed that left nothing behind, doesn't have a clean answer. Fossilization favors specific environments and specific circumstances of death. Everything else disappears without record. The gaps in the Phorus racid family tree are not empty because nothing lived there. They're empty because the evidence didn't survive. That's a different kind of unsettling than a 3-meter skull. 650 kilograms is not a weight that bird anatomy is designed to support. It exceeds every flying bird ever recorded by an order of magnitude. In the context of avian biology, it is a number that requires explanation. Dromornis statoni, late Miocene Australia, approximately 8 million years ago. Height estimates reach 3 meters, but the height is almost secondary to the mass. This was the engineering problem the animal had to solve first, and the skeleton reflects it. Legs built as thick columns of bone, not optimized for speed, but for load bearing. A frame that prioritized structural integrity over every other mechanical consideration. The skull was large and deep, the beak broad and powerful. Early reconstructions leaned toward herbivory, and more recent jaw musculature and microwear analysis has generally supported that. Though herbivore, at 650 kilograms in late Miocene Australia, carries implications the word alone doesn't convey. The plant's Dromornis processed required a beak capable of applying enormous crushing force. Dromornis belonged to the family Dromornithidae, the mehirungs, sometimes called demon ducks of doom, a nickname that undersells the strangeness and oversells the duck part. They were not closely related to ducks, occupying an isolated branch of the avian family tree, shaped almost entirely on the Australian continent. The ecosystem around Dromornis included early ancestors of modern Australian megafauna, giant wombats, early relatives of kangaroos, large reptiles. Within that community, Dromornis occupied a niche defined almost entirely by scale. It was simply too large for most of the ecological pressures shaping everything around it. The Dromornithid lineage persisted long after Dromornis itself disappeared. Smaller relatives survived into periods overlapping with early human presence on the Australian continent. Whether humans encountered them directly remains an open question. The last of them disappeared around 50,000 years ago. The timing is not a coincidence most researchers are comfortable dismissing. Here is where the timeline becomes personal. Titanis wooleri, Florida and Texas, somewhere between 5 million and 10,000 years ago. A terror bird, a genuine Forus racid, living and hunting in North America. Not South America, where the family originated and dominated. North America, the continent where, at the far end of that timeline, human beings were arriving. The mechanism was the Great American Biotic Interchange, the geological event that occurred when the Isthmus of Panama finished forming around 3 million years ago, creating a land bridge between continents that had been separated for tens of millions of years. Animals moved both directions. Titanis moved north. It stood around 1.5 to 2 meters tall, lighter and somewhat more compact than Forus racos, but carrying the same fundamental architecture: long legs, reduced wings, and a skull built around that downward hooking beak. Early reconstructions gave it grasping hook-like forelimbs, but later analysis walked that back. The forelimbs were small and largely vestigial, consistent with the rest of the family. What wasn't walked back was the timeline. The most recent Titanis fossils date to approximately 10,000 years ago. Anatomically modern humans reached North America somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. The overlap window is real. Direct evidence of human-Titanis interaction has not been found, but the temporal gap between them is narrow enough that dismissing the possibility entirely requires more confidence than the current evidence supports. 10,000 years ago is not deep time. In human history, it's the early Holocene, when agriculture was beginning in the Fertile Crescent and the last woolly mammoths were still alive on isolated Arctic islands. Titanis was the last of its lineage. Terror birds had held apex predator status in South America for roughly 30 million years, one of the longest continuous predatory dynasties in terrestrial vertebrate history. Titanis carried that lineage into a new continent and nearly into recorded human memory. It didn't make it. Climate shifts, habitat change, and competition from placental predators, cats and canids that crossed the same land bridge in the opposite direction, likely ended the dynasty that began after the dinosaurs disappeared. The birds alive today carry that deeper lineage, not of Titanis specifically. The Forus racids left no living line, but the class itself traces back through the same origin point.